Iran did not fire those missiles simply to hit Israel. If Tehran and Oppos' objective had been maximum destruction, the operation would have looked very different. The number of missiles, the timing, the advance warnings, the choice of targets, and even the public messaging surrounding the attack all point toward a different conclusion. Israel was the immediate target, but it was not the primary audience. The real audience was Washington, and perhaps even more importantly, the broader network of regional actors watching closely from Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, Ankara, Moscow, and Beijing. Because in modern geopolitics, missile strikes are not always designed to destroy military infrastructure. Sometimes they are designed to communicate strategic intent. Sometimes they are meant to establish new rules. And sometimes they are intended to answer a question that every rival has been asking for years. How far is Iran willing to go? For decades, Iran has built its regional strategy around a simple but powerful idea: avoid direct conventional war while creating enough military pressure to make any attack against it prohibitively expensive. That strategy depends on one critical factor: credibility. Not the credibility of speeches, not the credibility of diplomatic statements, the credibility of action. A deterrent only works if your adversaries believe you are prepared to use it. That is why understanding Iran and Oppos' missile strikes requires looking beyond the immediate headlines. Because the story is not about the damage caused, it is about the message delivered. At first glance, the recent escalation appears straightforward. Iran launched missiles toward Israel in response to Israeli actions against Iranian interests and senior figures. The world watched anxiously as air defense systems activated across the region. Governments issued emergency statements. Markets reacted. Analysts debated whether the Middle East had crossed a dangerous threshold. But beneath the visible crisis lies a more important question. Why did Iran choose this moment? Why respond directly now after decades of relying primarily on proxy forces and regional partners? And why conduct an operation that appeared carefully calibrated to avoid triggering an uncontrollable regional war? These questions matter because Iran and Oppos' behavior often appears contradictory to outside observers. On one hand, Tehran supports an extensive network of allied groups across the region. On the other, it frequently exercises remarkable restraint when faced with opportunities for escalation. It speaks the language of resistance while often acting with the caution of a status quo power. This apparent contradiction has led many analysts to misunderstand how Iranian leaders think about strategy. Iran is not seeking perpetual chaos, nor is it seeking direct military confrontation with the United States or Israel. Its primary objective is much more specific. It wants to reshape the regional balance of power in ways that increase its security, reduce American influence, and establish itself as an indispensable actor in Middle Eastern affairs. Everything else flows from that objective: its missile program, its regional partnerships, its diplomatic outreach, its economic relationships with China and Russia, its nuclear calculations. All are components of a long-term strategy designed to solve a problem that has shaped Iranian thinking since 1979. How can a country surrounded by stronger conventional adversaries prevent regime-threatening conflict? Most countries answer this question by building larger armies. Iran chose a different path. It developed what military strategists call asymmetric deterrence. Rather than matching its rivals tank for tank or aircraft for aircraft, Iran invested in capabilities that raised the costs of military action against it. Ballistic missile, drones, maritime disruption capability, regional alliances, cyber operations. Each component serves the same purpose: to convince adversaries that even a successful attack on Iran would produce unacceptable consequences. This strategy emerged from experience, particularly the experience of the Iran-Iraq War. Between 1980 and 1988, Iran faced invasion, international isolation, chemical weapons attacks, and limited external support. The lesson Iranian leaders drew from that conflict was profound. Dependence on outside powers creates vulnerability. Military weakness invites pressure. Strategic depth is essential for survival. These lessons still shape Tehran and Apo's decision-making today. When Iranian officials discuss security, they rarely focus only on borders. Instead, they think in terms of influence networks, buffer zones, and deterrence layers. From their perspective, threats must be managed far from Iranian territory. This helps explain why Iran has spent decades cultivating relationships across the region. Critics describe these relationships as instruments of destabilization. Iranian leaders view them as insurance policies. You do not have to agree with this logic to recognize its strategic coherence. Because from Tehran and Apo's perspective, the Middle East is filled with examples of what happens to governments that fail to create sufficient deterrence. Iraq under Saddam Hussein, Libya under Muammar Gaddafi, even Syria during the early years of its civil war. Iranian policymakers study these cases closely, and they draw a consistent conclusion. States without credible deterrent capabilities become vulnerable to external pressure. States capable of imposing costs maintain greater strategic autonomy. This is why Iran and Apo's missile program occupies such a central role in its national security doctrine. Missiles provide reach. They provide flexibility. And, perhaps most importantly, they provide visibility. A missile launch sends a message that cannot be ignored. It demonstrates capability in real time. It forces adversaries to calculate risk. It changes expectations. That last point is particularly important, because international politics is often less about capabilities themselves and more about perceptions of capability. What your rivals believe you can do matters just as much as what you can actually do, sometimes even more. Most observers interpreted Iran and Apo's missile strikes through the lens of retaliation. Iran was attacked. Iran responded. Case closed. But that explanation misses a crucial point. Retaliation was only the mechanism. Deterrence was the objective. Iran was not merely responding to a specific event. It was attempting to shape future behavior. Specifically, it was trying to redefine the cost-benefit calculations of its adversaries. Tehran wanted decision-makers in Washington and Jerusalem to ask themselves a different question before authorizing future operations. Not whether they could strike Iranian interests, but whether the consequences would be worth it. And that distinction changes everything. Because if the objective is deterrence rather than revenge, then the success of the operation depends less on physical destruction and more on psychological impact. The key metric becomes perception. Did Iran demonstrate capability? Did it demonstrate resolve? Did it establish credibility without triggering a broader conflict? From Tehran and Apo's perspective, these are the questions that matter most, which helps explain why the operation appeared so carefully designed. Too weak, and deterrence erodes. Too strong, and escalation spirals beyond control. Iran and Apo's challenge has always been finding the narrow space between passivity and provocation, a space where it can demonstrate strength without inviting overwhelming retaliation. That balancing act has become increasingly difficult as the regional environment changes. The United States remains militarily dominant. Israel has expanded its regional relationships. Gulf states are diversifying their security partnerships. China is increasing its economic influence. Russia is seeking new footholds, and Iran itself faces significant domestic economic pressures. Under these conditions, maintaining deterrence requires constant adaptation, which raises an even more important question. What if these missile strikes were not primarily about responding to the past? What if they were designed to prepare the region for a very different future? What future was Iran preparing for? To answer that question, we need to understand a reality that many discussions about the Middle East overlook. Iranian strategy is rarely reactive. It is cumulative. Tehran does not evaluate events individually. It connects them into broader trends that unfold over years, sometimes decades. From Iran and Apo's perspective, the regional landscape is changing in ways that create both risks and opportunities. The most significant change is not military. It is political. For nearly half a century, the Middle East operated under a relatively stable assumption. The United States was the undisputed external power capable of shaping regional outcomes. Iran and Oppos' grand strategy has always been built around challenging that assumption, not by replacing the United States directly, but by making American dominance increasingly expensive and increasingly difficult to sustain. This objective helps explain why Iran often appears patient when others expect urgency. Time, in Tehran and Oppos' view, may be its greatest strategic asset. American administrations change. Regional alliances shift. Public opinion evolves. Economic priorities move elsewhere. Iranian leaders believe that if they can preserve the regime, maintain deterrence, and avoid catastrophic war, the geopolitical environment will gradually move in their favor. Whether that assessment proves correct remains uncertain, but it shapes nearly every major Iranian decision. This is where many outside observers misunderstand the purpose of Iran and Oppos' regional network. The conventional narrative portrays Iran and Oppos' relationships with armed groups across the Middle East as tools of expansion. There is some truth in that interpretation, but it overlooks their primary strategic function. They are not merely instruments of influence. They are layers of deterrence. Each layer complicates the calculations of potential adversaries. An attack on Iran could trigger consequences in multiple locations simultaneously. The result is strategic ambiguity, and strategic ambiguity creates caution. For Tehran, this approach solves a fundamental problem. How does a country with economic constraints and limited conventional military power compete against wealthier rivals supported by the world and Oppos' strongest military alliance network? The answer is not symmetrical competition. It is distributed risk. Instead of concentrating military power within its borders, Iran extends deterrence outward. Critics call this a proxy strategy. Iranian planners see it as strategic depth. The distinction matters because it reveals how Tehran interprets vulnerability. For many states, borders define security. For Iran, security begins beyond its borders. That mindset emerged directly from historical experience. When Iraq invaded Iran in 1980, the war was fought on Iranian territory. The human and economic costs were immense. The lesson was clear. Future threats must be managed before they reach Iranian soil. This logic explains why Iranian officials often speak about regional events in language that seems disconnected from geography. For them, developments in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, the Persian Gulf, and the Red Sea are not separate issues. They are interconnected components of a single security architecture. Understanding this framework helps explain why Iran and Oppos' missile strikes matter beyond their immediate military impact. The operation was a signal that Tehran is willing to defend that architecture more openly than before. For decades, Iran preferred indirect responses. Plausible deniability offered flexibility. Proxy networks reduced risks. Direct confrontation remained the exception. So why change the formula now? Because deterrence depends on credibility, and credibility must occasionally be demonstrated. There comes a point when excessive restraint creates its own dangers. If rivals conclude that Iran will never respond directly, the deterrent effect weakens. Red lines become invitations rather than warnings. From Tehran and Oppos' perspective, recent events may have pushed that calculation to its limit. The leadership likely concluded that failing to respond directly would create greater long-term risks than acting. But equally important is how Iran chose to act. Notice what did not happen. Iran did not seek maximum casualties. It did not target civilian infrastructure indiscriminately. It did not attempt to sustain prolonged escalation. Instead, it conducted a highly visible operation designed to demonstrate capability while preserving space for de-escalation. This is classic coercive signaling. The objective is not victory. The objective is communication. The message was straightforward. Iran can impose costs directly if necessary, but it remains interested in controlling escalation. That dual message matters because it addresses multiple audiences simultaneously. To Israel, it signals capability. To the United States, it signals resolve. To regional partners, it signals reliability. And to domestic audiences, it signals strength. Successful deterrence requires all four audiences to receive the message. This balancing act reflects a broader reality about Iranian strategy. Tehran does not seek unlimited escalation. It seeks controlled instability. Enough tension to constrain adversaries. Not enough to trigger existential conflict. That may sound contradictory, but history shows that many regional powers have pursued similar approaches. The goal is not peace in the conventional sense. The goal is a stable equilibrium of pressure, an environment where opponents remain uncertain about the costs of their actions. The challenge, of course, is that controlled instability is difficult to control. Signals can be misunderstood. Intentions can be misread. Actions designed for deterrence can be interpreted as preparation for war. History is full of conflicts that neither side intended to fight. This risk is especially high when multiple actors operate within overlapping security environments. Consider the number of players involved: Iran, Israel, the United States, Gulf states, regional militias, global powers such as Russia and China. Each actor has different objectives. Each interprets events through its own strategic lens, and each faces domestic pressures that shape decision-making. In such an environment, even carefully calibrated actions carry significant risks. Yet Iran appears willing to accept those risks. Why? Because Tehran may believe that the regional order is already changing in ways that favor bolder action. American strategic attention is increasingly divided. Competition with China dominates Washington and Apos as long-term priorities. The war in Ukraine has strained resources and attention. Energy markets are evolving. Regional states are diversifying partnerships. For Iran, these trends create opportunity, not because the United States is leaving the Middle East entirely, but because its willingness to absorb costs there may be changing. Iranian strategists have long believed that endurance can offset material disadvantages. Their assumption is simple. External powers eventually reprioritize. Regional powers remain. This belief is rooted in history. Empires come and go. Neighboring states endure. From Tehran and Apos, as perspective, patience is not passive. It is strategic, which brings us to one of the most misunderstood aspects of Iranian policy. Iran does not necessarily need to win conventional confrontations. It only needs to avoid losing decisively. This distinction is essential. Western military thinking often focuses on battlefield dominance. Iranian strategy focuses on political outcomes. Can pressure be sustained? Can costs be imposed? Can adversaries be discouraged from future action? If the answer is yes, then even limited military capabilities can produce significant strategic effects. This approach resembles the logic employed by smaller powers throughout history. Vietnam against the United States, Afghanistan against the Soviet Union, North Korea against far stronger adversaries. The objective is not direct military superiority. It is the manipulation of political will. Iran and Apos leaders understand that their rivals possess superior conventional forces. They also understand that superior force does not automatically translate into strategic success, especially when the costs of action become unpredictable. This is why the missile strikes matter beyond the immediate moment. They represent an attempt to increase uncertainty, to force adversaries to ask difficult questions. How many missiles does Iran actually possess? How accurate are its systems? What other capabilities remain unseen? What might happen if future escalation becomes harder to contain? Deterrence thrives in uncertainty, and uncertainty, when managed effectively, can become a strategic resource. But Iran and Apos' approach also contains inherent vulnerabilities. Its economy remains under pressure. Its regional relationships are not always stable. Domestic expectations continue to evolve. Maintaining an extensive deterrence network requires resources. Resources require economic resilience. And economic resilience remains one of Tehran and Apos' greatest challenges. This tension It is also why Tehran seeks deeper relationships with powers that share an interest in a more multipolar world. Not because Iran expects alliances in the traditional sense, but because it sees opportunity in global competition. The less unified the international system becomes, the more room Iran has to maneuver. And that calculation is not entirely new. In fact, it reflects a pattern that has shaped the behavior of medium-sized powers throughout modern history. States facing stronger rivals often seek advantage not through direct confrontation, but through shifts in the broader balance of power. Iran is doing precisely that. The question is whether current events represent a temporary escalation, or the beginning of a more fundamental transformation in how Tehran intends to project power across the region. To understand whether this is a temporary adjustment or a lasting shift, we need to look backward, not to recent headlines, not even the last decade. We need to return to the formative experiences that shaped how Iran views power, vulnerability, and survival. Because states, like individuals, carry historical memories. And few countries in the modern Middle East are more influenced by historical memory than Iran. For many Western policymakers, the defining date is 1979. For Iranian strategists, the story begins earlier, much earlier. It includes the 19th century, when foreign empires competed for influence over Persian territory. It includes the 1953 coup that removed Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh after he nationalized Iran and Oppo's oil industry. And it includes decades of perceived external interference in Iranian affairs. Whether one accepts Tehran and Oppo's interpretation of these events is less important than understanding their impact. Strategic cultures are built on perceptions, and Iran and Oppo's strategic culture is deeply shaped by a conviction that external powers will exploit weakness whenever possible. This belief intensified dramatically during the Iran-Iraq War. For 8 years, Iran fought a costly conflict that left hundreds of thousands dead and reshaped an entire generation of leaders. Many of today and Oppo's decision-makers either fought in that war or were politically formed by it. Their lessons were not abstract. They were personal. They learned that international institutions offer limited protection. They learned that economic isolation can be endured. And they learned that military vulnerability carries unacceptable risks. Above all, they learned that survival depends on self-reliance. This is why Iran and Oppo's military doctrine differs so significantly from that of many other regional powers. Countries with extensive security guarantees often prioritize advanced platforms and technological superiority. Iran priorise résilience, redundancy, dispersal, the ability to absorb pressure and continue functioning. Missiles fit that doctrine. Drones fit that doctrine. Decentralized regional networks fit that doctrine. The goal is not to dominate every battlefield. The goal is to ensure that no adversary can achieve a quick, decisive victory. That objective has historical parallels. During the Cold War, smaller states frequently developed asymmetric capabilities to offset conventional disadvantages. North Korea built deterrence around the threat of unacceptable retaliation. Vietnam relied on endurance and political persistence. Even major powers have adopted similar logic. The Soviet Union understood that strategic depth could compensate for certain vulnerabilities. China, particularly in the decades before its military modernization, emphasized denying adversaries easy victories. Iran has adapted elements of each approach to fit its own circumstances. But perhaps the most relevant historical comparison is not military. It is economic. Consider the oil crises of the 1970s. Those events demonstrated a simple but powerful reality. The Middle East exerts global influence not only through military force, but through its position within the international economy. Energy flows, shipping routes, commodity prices, supply chains. Disruptions in the region create consequences far beyond the region itself. Iran understands this better than most. Its geography gives it leverage. Its position near critical maritime choke points gives it options. And its ability to influence regional stability gives it relevance. This does not mean Iran seeks to disrupt global markets constantly. In fact, sustained instability would damage Iran and Oppo's own interests. But the ability to create uncertainty is itself a form of power. Strategic influence often depends less on what a state does than on what others believe it could do. That principle helps explain why even limited military actions in the region frequently trigger disproportionate reactions in global markets. Investors are not pricing current events. They are pricing future risks. And future risks are precisely what Iran seeks to shape. By demonstrating capability, Tehran reminds the world that regional security cannot be discussed without considering Iranian interests. In effect, it is making an argument, not through speeches, through actions. The argument is simple. Any long-term regional order that excludes Iran will remain unstable. This objective does not necessarily require military victory. It requires recognition. Recognition that Iran possesses enough influence to affect outcomes across multiple domains: military, economic, political, diplomatic. This is why Tehran often appears comfortable operating below the threshold of full-scale war. Limited pressure can generate strategic leverage without inviting overwhelming retaliation. At least in theory. The challenge is that thresholds are not fixed. They evolve. Actions once considered extraordinary become normalized. Red lines shift. And each successful demonstration of capability creates incentives for further demonstrations. This dynamic creates a dangerous feedback loop. Restraint and deterrence. Its adversaries respond by strengthening their own deterrence. Each side interprets its actions as defensive. Each side views the other and Oppo's actions as provocative. Over time, the margin for miscalculation narrows. History offers many examples. The naval rivalry between Britain and Germany before the First World War. The nuclear competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. Regional rivalries throughout the Cold War. In each case, deterrence preserved peace while simultaneously increasing the consequences of failure. The Middle East now faces a similar paradox. The same capabilities that prevent war can also make accidental escalation more dangerous. Which brings us to the most important question. What happens next? If current trends continue, three broad scenarios appear possible. The first scenario is the most likely. A prolonged period of controlled confrontation. Iran continues to rely on calibrated demonstrations of force. Israel maintains pressure on Iranian networks and capabilities. The United States seeks to prevent escalation while preserving regional deterrence. Periods of tension alternate with periods of de-escalation. Crisis becomes the norm rather than the exception. This scenario resembles the strategic competition that has defined the region for years. The difference is that direct signaling between Iran and Israel becomes more visible. Rules gradually emerge. Informal understandings develop. Neither side trusts the other, but both recognize the costs of unrestricted conflict. The second scenario is less likely but increasingly plausible. Regional realignment accelerates. Gulf states pursue more independent foreign policies. China expands its diplomatic and economic role. American influence remains substantial but becomes more selective. Under these conditions, Iran gains additional room to maneuver, not because it becomes dominant, but because the regional system becomes more multipolar. This outcome would reward Tehran and Oppo's long-term strategy of endurance. It would validate the assumption that patience can offset material disadvantages. However, multipolarity also creates new uncertainties. More actors mean more competing interests. More competing interests mean more opportunities for misunderstanding, which leads to the third scenario, the high-impact scenario, a crisis that neither side intends to create. Not a deliberate decision for war, a miscalculation, a misunderstood signal, an operation that causes unexpected casualties, a technical failure, a political leader facing domestic pressure with limited room for compromise. History suggests that major conflicts often emerge this way, not because leaders seek catastrophe, but because they misjudge risks. The danger, each side believes it understands the other and oppose. S red lines. Each side believes escalation can be controlled, and each side believes deterrence is working, until suddenly it ISN and oppose. T. That is why Iran and oppose. S missile strikes matter far beyond their immediate military effect. They are not simply events. They are signals within a larger strategic conversation. A conversation about power, about deterrence, about the future of regional order, and perhaps most importantly, about the changing nature of American influence in the Middle East. Because the real question is not whether Iran can challenge the existing order. The real question is whether the existing order can adapt to Iran and oppose as strategy. History rarely repeats itself exactly, but it often rewards those who understand its patterns.